He didn't stop working. That was the problem. When things became harder, he worked more. When money disappeared faster, he shortened his sleep. When food grew scarce, he ignored hunger and kept going. Everything he had been taught told him this would work. It always had. Until it didn't. There was no announcement. No declaration that the rules had changed. No moment when someone told him that effort was no longer enough. The system simply moved the line. In medieval times, work was never meant to save you. It was meant to keep you useful. And usefulness had limits. This is the story of the day a man realized that no matter how much he worked, survival was no longer guaranteed, because the system had decided he was no longer worth sustaining. He noticed the change before anyone spoke about it. Not in the rules, not in the payments, not in the demands. He noticed it in the hours. The day began earlier now. Not because the sun rose sooner, but because he could no longer afford to waste even a moment of light. Where he once woke at first glow, he now rose in darkness, hands moving by memory alone. Boots, clothes, tools Yol reached for without thought, as if speed itself might protect him. At first it felt like effort, honest effort, the kind people praised. When the workday ended and nothing had improved, he told himself that meant he simply needed more time, more strength, more discipline. So he gave it. He shortened his rest. He ate less to save money. He learned to ignore the ache in his back and the stiffness in his hands that no longer faded overnight. Pain became background noise, present, constant, manageable. The system did not respond. That was the first thing he did not understand. In every lesson he had been taught, work created movement. If not reward, then at least progress. If not progress, then stability. Now, work expanded and nothing shifted. He worked longer days and stood in the same place. The land still demanded attention, tools still broke, payments still arrived on time. But the margin, that thin space where effort once lived, was gone. Before, a good week could recover a bad one. Before, extra work created a small buffer. Now effort disappeared the moment it was given. The system absorbed it. He noticed others working the same way. Faces harder, bodies thinner, conversations shorter. Everyone moving faster, as if speed itself had become currency. No one spoke about it directly. Speaking would have made it real. Instead, people framed it as temporary, a bad stretch, an adjustment period. A season that would pass if everyone just endured long enough. That language mattered. It kept people working. He told himself the same story, repeated it while his hands shook from fatigue and his breath shortened earlier each day. He reminded himself that survival had always required sacrifice, that this was nothing new. But it was new, before sacrifice had an endpoint, a harvest. A payment cleared, a moment when pressure eased, if only briefly. Now, pressure stacked. One obligation rolled directly into the next. One task bled into another without pause. Even rest became conditional, something borrowed from tomorrow, never repaid. His body began to register the change before his mind allowed it. Small injuries lingered, a cut reopened, a strain never healed fully. His grip weakened, then compensated, then failed in a different place. The system did not slow when his body did. It could not afford to. He watched the way authority responded, or rather did not respond. No concern, no adjustment. No recognition that the effort had increased. The system did not track effort. It tracked output. And output, no matter how it was achieved, was expected. This was the shift he could not yet name. Work was no longer something exchanged. It was something extracted. When he paid what he owed, nothing loosened. When he met demands early, nothing improved. Compliance no longer purchased stability. It only confirmed availability. He had become reliable. Reliability was dangerous. Reliable people could be pushed further without resistance. The system rewarded unpredictability with attention, predictability with silence. Silence meant pressure. By the end of the season, he could no longer remember what a full day of rest felt like. Sleep shortened not by choice, but by necessity. There was always something unfinished, something delayed, something that could not wait. Waiting had become expensive. The moment he stopped, the gap widened. That fear kept him moving. He worked not because it helped, but because stopping felt worse. That was when he understood dimly that something fundamental had changed. The system no longer required his labor to function. It required his exhaustion. Exhaustion reduced questions. Exhaustion prevented planning. Exhaustion kept people focused on surviving the day instead of examining the structure around them. Work had crossed a threshold. It no longer sustained him. It consumed him, and still, he worked. Because in a world where effort no longer protected you, the absence of effort was treated as guilt. The payments never stopped. That was the first rule everyone learned, even if no one said it out loud. Work could fluctuate. Harvests could fail. Bodies could break. But the payments arrived with the same regularity as the seasons. Sometimes earlier, never later. At first, paying felt like purpose, a structure, a reason to keep going. If he paid, he stayed. If he stayed, he worked. If he worked, he survived. The logic was simple enough to accept without question. But as the demands grew, the logic changed shape. Payment was no longer something that secured his position. It was something that delayed removal. Each coin he handed over did not buy stability. It bought time. And time, he learned, was the most expensive thing in the system. He noticed how the payments were framed. Never as punishment, never as pressure, always as necessity. This is what you owe. This is what is required. This is what keeps things in order. Order was the word they used when they meant control. As his labor increased, the payments adjusted. Not openly, quietly. A fee added here, a requirement clarified there. An old obligation resurfacing under a new name. None of it felt illegal. That was important. The system did not survive by breaking rules. It survived by expanding them. He began to understand that the payment itself was not the core mechanism. Dependence was. Every payment assumed continuation. Every continuation assumed obedience. You could not negotiate from inside the cycle, because negotiation itself required leverage. And leverage was what the system ensured you never had. If you failed to pay, the consequences were clear. If you paid, the consequences were postponed. Postponement felt like success. That illusion kept people compliant. He paid before eating, paid before repairing tools, paid before resting. The payment came first, because the cost of not paying was always larger, always undefined. Undefined consequences were the most effective. He once asked what would happen if he couldn't pay. The answer was not violent, not threatening. It was procedural. Adjustments would be made. Adjustments meant reclassification. Reclassification meant loss of permission. Loss of permission meant removal. The system never needed to explain the full chain. Everyone understood enough to fear it, so he paid. Even when it meant borrowing. Even when it meant selling. Even when it meant working at a pace his body could not maintain. The system did not care how the payment was made, only that it arrived. He noticed something else, too. Payment did not reduce scrutiny. It increased it. Those who paid reliably were watched more closely, not less. Reliability signaled capacity. Capacity invited extraction. People who struggled were given space, briefly. People who endured were pushed further. That inversion was deliberate. The system did not want people to fail quickly. It wanted them to function indefinitely at the edge. He learned to recognize the moment payment stopped being a transaction and became a test. The test was simple: how much could be taken before collapse? Each season, the answer was recalculated. He felt it in the way requests became more precise, less negotiable, in the way leniency disappeared without announcement, in the way effort was assumed rather than acknowledged. He was no longer paying to remain. He was paying to be evaluated. That realization unsettled him more than any missed payment ever had. It meant that success did not move him closer to safety. It moved him closer to exhaustion. Payment no longer marked progress, it marked compliance. And compliance was not rewarded. It was exploited. By the end of that year, he understood that payment was not about money. Money was only the language. What the system actually collected was certainty. Certainty that he would return, certainty that he would endure, certainty that he would not resist. Every payment confirmed that certainty. And as long as the system could count on him, it would continue to count from him. Paying did not protect him from loss. It made him predictable enough to be used until nothing remained. The body noticed before the system did. That was always how it happened. Pain arrived quietly, without warning, without ceremony. It did not announce itself as injury. It began as resistance, a stiffness that lingered longer than it should, a weakness that did not disappear after rest. At first, he treated it as inconvenience. Everyone hurt. Everyone worked through it. Pain was part of the agreement, even if no one remembered signing it. So he adjusted. He shifted how he lifted, changed how he carried weight, favored one side of his body, then the other. He learned new ways to hide limitation behind movement. The system did not adjust with him. It never did. Work still arrived at the same pace. Payment still demanded the same output. Time did not slow to accommodate strain. The system assumed the body was infinite, or rather replaceable. He noticed how injury changed the value of his labor. Not officially, not on parchment, but in practice. Tasks that once went to him were given to others. Offers came with conditions. Work that demanded strength disappeared. Work that demanded endurance increased. Endurance was cheaper. Pain, he learned, was tolerated. Weakness was not. He stopped speaking about it. Not because he was ashamed, but because speaking did nothing. There was no process for pain. No adjustment for deterioration. The body was not a concern, it was a resource. Each day, he calculated not how much he could do, but how much he could endure without collapsing. Collapse was dangerous. Collapse invited attention. Attention invited reclassification. Reclassification meant loss, so he learned to work within narrowing limits. Shorter breath, slower recovery, longer nights spent awake not from thought, but from discomfort. Sleep became shallow, food became functional, rest became something postponed. The body protested, he ignored it. That was the lesson the system taught best. Ignore what hurts long enough, and it will either stop or remove you from the equation. Both outcomes were acceptable. He saw it happen to others. Men who limped until they didn't return. Women whose hands failed and who were quietly reassigned to less visible roles. Bodies that broke were not mourned. They were replaced. The system did not mark injury as loss. It marked it as inefficiency. Inefficiency triggered adjustment. Adjustment triggered removal. He worked faster when his body slowed, trying to compensate. He stayed longer when fatigue deepened, believing that visibility through effort might protect him. It did not. The system did not reward those who pushed through pain. It expected them to. Pain, he realized, was already accounted for. The moment he understood this was not dramatic. It came one afternoon when his hands refused to close properly around a tool he had used for years. The refusal was brief, subtle, but it terrified him. Because for the first time, the body had said no. And the system did not recognize refusal. He finished the task anyway, sloppily, slower than before. He felt eyes on him, not concerned, measuring. The next offer of work came later. Paid less, required more time. That was the signal. The system had noticed. From then on, every day became negotiation between body and survival. He rationed strength the way others rationed food, saving it for moments that mattered. Spending it when there was no choice. The body became currency. He spent it carefully, knowing there would be no refund. As months passed, pain stopped being sharp and became dull, constant, predictable, easier to ignore, harder to escape. That constancy was dangerous. It made deterioration invisible. The system thrived on invisible decline. As long as he showed up, he was counted as functional. As long as he moved, he was counted as capable. The moment he stopped, he would be counted as excess. That knowledge kept him working. Not because work helped him, but because stopping would reveal how little the system valued him without it. He realized then that the body was the final limit the system tested. Money could be borrowed, time could be extended, land could be reassigned, but the body could only be taken once. And the system intended to take it slowly, completely, without ever acknowledging it had done so. Choice was something people talked about when they wanted to feel alive. It was never something the system needed to function. He believed in choice for a long time. Not in grand decisions, but in small adjustments. The kind that felt reasonable. The kind that gave the illusion of control without demanding confrontation. If he chose to work earlier, he could rest later. If he chose to eat less now, he could recover later. If he chose the harder task today, tomorrow might be easier. That logic had carried him this far. So when things became unbearable, he did what he had always been taught to do. He tried to choose better. He began evaluating every decision as if it mattered more than it did. Which work to accept, which payment to delay, which expense to cut, which pain to ignore. Choice became obsessive, not empowering, exhausting. Every option carried loss. Every path closed another. There was no decision that led to improvement, only decisions that postponed collapse. That was the moment choice revealed its true function. It was not a path forward. It was a method of distributing blame. The system did not tell him what to do. It did not command. It did not threaten. It presented options. And every option led to the same place. He could work more and break sooner. He could work less and lose permission faster. He could borrow and delay. He could refuse and accelerate loss. Each choice felt personal. Each outcome was predetermined. That was the genius of it. The system never said, "You must." It said, "You may." And in that permission, it absolved itself. When he chose and things worsened, the failure felt like his. When the body failed, it felt like a miscalculation. When money disappeared, it felt like poor planning. Choice turned structure into guilt. He noticed how others spoke about their situations, always in terms of decisions. If only I should have, next time I will. No one spoke about the system, because the system had taught them not to see it. The more he tried to choose his way out, the smaller the choices became. Decisions shrank from months to weeks, from weeks to days, from days to hours. Eventually, choice existed only moment to moment. Do I stop now, or do I push a little longer? Do I eat today, or save for tomorrow? Do I ask for help, or disappear quietly? Those were not choices, they were thresholds. Crossing one did not change direction. It only determined how quickly the end arrived. He asked himself, once, what real choice would look like. The answer frightened him. Real choice would mean refusing the terms entirely, stepping outside the structure, risking everything at once instead of losing it slowly. The system had made that option unthinkable. Not impossible, unthinkable. Because it did not punish refusal immediately. It punished uncertainty. It punished instability. It punished anyone who disrupted predictability. People who refused cleanly were dangerous. People who endured were manageable. Choice kept people enduring. He realized then that choice was not freedom. It was responsibility without power. The system handed him decisions stripped of consequence. No matter what he chose, the outcome served the structure, not him. And when things worsened, as they always did, the narrative was ready. He chose wrong. He mismanaged. He failed. The system remained neutral, clean, untouched. That realization did not arrive as anger. It arrived as emptiness. The exhaustion of realizing that effort, obedience, endurance, and choice all led to the same diminishing return. Choice had been reduced to choreography, movement without escape. From that moment on, he stopped asking which option was better. He began asking a different question. How long before none of them mattered? That question did not empower him, but it clarified something essential. He had never been choosing between futures. He had only been choosing how to experience the same ending. The system did not rush, it never did. Urgency was for those without power. The system had time, records, and patience. It waited until pressure alone was no longer enough, until the quiet mechanisms failed to produce compliance. Then it acted. The first sign was not a threat. It was a notice, delivered without drama, without accusation, written in the same neutral language he had seen his entire life, the kind of language that made consequence feel administrative rather than intentional. It informed him of a discrepancy, a recalculation, a balance that no longer aligned with expectation. The words were precise, cold, impossible to argue with because they did not invite argument. This was not a negotiation, it was an update. He read it more than once, not because he didn't understand it, but because he needed time to accept that the system had finally acknowledged him, and that acknowledgement was not protection. It was exposure. From that moment on, everything changed, not outwardly, not immediately, but internally, the pressure shifted. Before, debt had been something he carried. Now, it was something that followed him. He felt it in the way work offers arrived already compromised, in the way terms were stated before effort was discussed, in the way trust evaporated without explanation. The system had marked him. Being marked did not mean being removed. Removal was inefficient. Being marked meant being squeezed. He was still allowed to work, still allowed to pay, still allowed to exist within the structure. But now every interaction assumed deficiency. He was no longer neutral. The recalculation did not demand an impossible amount. That was deliberate. Impossible demands created resistance. This one created strain. Strain was more useful. He paid what he could, delayed the rest, borrowed quietly. Borrowing created new lines on parchment, new witnesses, new dependencies. The system welcomed this. Complexity increased control. Each borrowed coin multiplied obligation. Each obligation multiplied visibility. Visibility narrowed options. Soon, every payment felt like triage, choosing which wound to ignore, which debt to delay, which promise to break. The system did not need to enforce anything yet. Pressure was sufficient. He noticed how quickly patience disappeared. Requests that once took days were denied without explanation. Permissions came with added conditions. Conditions came with fees. Fees came with deadlines. Deadlines arrived faster than recovery. The system did not say he had failed. It behaved as if failure was assumed. That assumption changed everything. He worked harder, not because it helped, but because stopping would confirm what the system already believed. He pushed through pain that no longer faded. Ignored warnings his body sent clearly. Effort became defensive. He was no longer working to improve his situation. He was working to disprove suspicion. Suspicion was expensive. The more he paid, the more the system required. The more he complied, the more compliance was expected. There was no finish line. That was when he understood the purpose of recalculation. It was not to correct imbalance. It was to redefine normal. The system did not punish him for falling behind. It adjusted expectations so that falling behind became permanent. Once marked, there was no return to neutrality. He saw others in the same position. Men and women who had crossed some invisible threshold and were now permanently reactive, always responding, never planning. They lived one notice away from collapse. The system kept them there deliberately. Stability created independence. Instability created dependence. Dependence was profitable. He began to understand that the system did not need everyone to fail. It needed enough people permanently close to failure to set the standard for everyone else. Fear radiated outward. Others worked harder when they saw what happened to him. Others paid earlier. Others accepted worse terms. The system used his pressure to discipline the rest. That was the moment when debt stopped being personal. It became instructional. He was not being punished. He was being used. The realization was devastating not because it surprised him, but because it clarified everything that had come before. All the effort, all the endurance, all the choices, none of it had been leading toward freedom. It had been preparing him for extraction. The system did not need to take everything at once. It preferred to take slowly, because slow loss kept people functional. And functionality was the only thing the system ever valued. There came a point when sacrifice stopped working. Not because he refused to give more, but because there was nothing left to remove. For a long time, cutting back had felt like control. Skip a meal, delay a repair, work through pain, sleep less. Each sacrifice created the illusion that the situation was still manageable, that something could still be adjusted. Now adjustment had ended. Every reduction had already been made. He woke earlier than ever, but the day no longer expanded. He worked longer, but the work no longer produced anything that could be redirected. Every coin had already been promised before it reached his hand. Every effort arrived pre-allocated. There was no slack left in the system. The absence of slack was terrifying, because slack was where survival lived. Without it, every minor disruption became fatal. A sick day meant debt, a broken tool meant hunger. A missed payment meant recalculation. There was no buffer between error and consequence. The system had achieved perfect efficiency. He noticed it first in the decisions he could no longer make. He could not choose to eat less. He was already eating the minimum. He could not choose to rest less. Rest had already been eliminated. He could not choose cheaper options. There were none. Choice had collapsed into necessity. The body reflected this collapse quickly. Weight dropped. Strength faded. Endurance narrowed. Tasks that once felt automatic now required deliberate effort. The system did not notice. Or rather, it did not care. As long as output existed, the input was irrelevant. He stopped repairing things properly. There was no time, no money, no benefit. Everything became temporary. Tools were held together just long enough to finish the task at hand. Clothing was patched until it failed completely. Life became provisional. The future disappeared not as an idea, but as a consideration. Planning beyond the next payment felt irresponsible, almost indulgent. The system rewarded this focus. People who lived moment to moment did not challenge structure. They reacted instead of resisting. Reaction was predictable. Predictability was controllable. He saw how others reached this stage and vanished quietly. Not removed, not punished, simply absorbed into a lower category of existence. Fewer options, less visibility, less expectation. The system did not collapse people suddenly. It downgraded them. Once downgraded, return was impossible. There was no process for recovery, only continued compliance at reduced value. He recognized the signs in himself. Work offered only the lowest pay. Conditions worsened without explanation. Requests were denied automatically. He was no longer evaluated. He had been classified. Classification was final. The worst part was not the loss of dignity. It was the loss of surprise. Nothing unexpected happened anymore. Every outcome followed logically from the one before it. There was no shock left, only continuation. He realized then that the system did not break people by force. It exhausted them until resistance felt irrational. By the time people reached this stage, rebellion seemed childish. Risk felt irresponsible. Survival required obedience so complete that even the idea of refusal felt dangerous. The system relied on this. It did not need loyalty. It needed fatigue. Fatigue removed alternatives more effectively than fear ever could. He still worked. Of course he did. Stopping would not have been protest. It would have been disappearance. And disappearance was expensive. As long as he remained visible enough to extract from, system tolerated him. The moment he stopped producing, tolerance would end. That knowledge kept him moving long after movement stopped serving him. He understood then that sacrifice had never been a path forward. It had been a test. A test of how much could be taken before nothing remained. And the system had passed that test perfectly. By the time he understood the system, understanding no longer changed anything. That was not an accident. The system did not hide its nature forever. It revealed it only when revelation had no cost. When recognition arrived too late to become resistance. That timing mattered. If people understood too early, they might refuse. If they understood too late, they would endure. The system relied on endurance. It never required belief. People did not have to agree with it, admire it, or even respect it. They only had to continue operating inside it. And they did. Looking back, he saw the pattern clearly. Debt was not a consequence of failure. It was the starting condition. Work was not a path to freedom. It was proof of compliance. Choice was not agency. It was blame management. Sacrifice was not virtue. It was extraction. Every concept he had been taught had been inverted quietly, without announcement. Words remained the same, but their function had changed. That was how the system protected itself. People believed they were participating in something fair because the language of fairness was still used. But fairness required symmetry, and there was none. The system adjusted itself continuously while demanding rigidity from everyone inside it. It bent. They broke. The system did not punish everyone equally. It didn't need to. It only needed to punish visibly enough to establish fear, and quietly enough to avoid accountability. Most people were not destroyed. They were diminished. Diminishment was safer. It kept people alive, working, paying, but without enough strength or clarity to disrupt anything larger than their own survival. That was the real purpose of debt. Not collection, control. Debt created timelines people could not escape. It attached the future to obligations from the past. It made tomorrow predictable in the worst possible way. Predictability made planning unnecessary. Planning made resistance possible, so the system removed planning first. He understood now why nothing ever truly improved. Why every gain triggered new demands. Why effort was absorbed instead of rewarded. Improvement threatened hierarchy. If effort led to freedom, the structure would collapse. So effort was allowed only within limits. Enough to survive, never enough to escape. This was not cruelty. It was efficiency. A system that relies on cruelty must justify itself. A system that relies on efficiency simply continues. By the time people realized this, they were already embedded too deeply to leave without losing everything at once. And that was the final trap. The system made total loss feel worse than gradual loss. It trained people to prefer slow erosion over sudden collapse, to choose certainty over possibility. Certainty, even when it meant suffering. He did not hate the system. Hatred required energy. He understood it. Understanding brought something colder than anger, clarity, and clarity revealed the most devastating truth of all. The system did not need to be enforced anymore. People enforced it themselves. They warned their children to be careful. They taught obedience as wisdom. They framed endurance as character. The system reproduced through advice, through caution, through fear disguised as responsibility. That was how it lasted. If you want to understand how debt becomes destiny, how money replaces chains without changing outcomes, and how entire lives are shaped before choice ever exists, subscribe, because this story is not about one man. It is about a system that works perfectly as long as no one escapes it.